Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today from Beirut, Lebanon is Dr. Jihad Yazigi, who is editor of the Syria Report. Jihad, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me with you.
Unfortunately, the topic about which we spoke months ago continues. The Syrian situation, if anything, is getting more difficult, more consequential for the region. And you're an economist and you study issues having to do with Syria and the Middle East from an economic perspective. Do you want to say anything general at this point about, even if there were peace tomorrow morning, what that really means in terms of socioeconomic realities? And then I'm going to ask you some questions about refugees.
Well, I think one thing to have in mind is that the 3 years of chaos in Syria have led to the emergence of a real war economy. In many parts of the country, you have new forces that are profiting from the withdrawal of the state and the lack of supply of goods and services by the state to have their own, fiefdoms, their new areas of control. And both on the opposition side and on the regime side, you have many groups that are profiting from the conflict to amass wealth. And in turn, these new sources of wealth are helping these people and these groups making money, but also fund their war effort. So we obviously need to have in mind that you have various sources of money making. You have many money making opportunities during the war, whether it's, for instance, through the control of oil fields, and we are going to see this in Iraq more and more, through the control of border posts or checkpoints. And this war economy is certainly fueling the conflict to a good extent. Ending the conflict in Syria will certainly require taking into account these dynamics.
When the refugees, whose plight is, indescribable, when the refugees see that their city has switched hands and that perhaps it's okay to go back again, does that help feed the economy, or does it help feed the war economy? Does it help stabilize the political situation, or does it help make it less stable?
Well, it is quite difficult to answer to the question because you have very changing circumstances. We have recently, for instance, seen that the regime has taken back the city of Kesab, which is inhabited, as you know, by a large Armenian community, which is on the border with Turkey. But are we sure that the situation is going to remain stable there or not? That's in itself a major question that everyone who wants to return has to ask himself. Obviously, if people stay in Syria, spend in Syria, invest in Syria, this is good for the economy. The economy in situation like that needs the involvement or the participation of investors, of people who are spending. But the big problem, obviously, is that as long as you don't have a comprehensive peace deal, if you're not sure of long-term stability, you're not going to have the economy that is going to start moving again. You're going to have some, small businesses going back. But if you want investments, if you want people to use their savings to spend and not to keep them as savings, you need to give them clear prospects for the future. Unfortunately, we're not seeing anything happening in Syria. Winning a battle, taking over, or losing a city doesn't make much of a difference this day if you don't have assurances that the situation is going to remain stable. The big problem when you look at the economics is the stability. It is the prospect, the long-term prospects. When these are clear, then you can have you can have investment, and you can have, some sort of economic improvement, recovery.
I don't know if this is right, but my understanding is that pre-war, most consumer goods were produced in Syria by Syrians, that at least at the subsistence level, the basic level, these weren't imports. In this war economy, are those basic consumer goods still somehow available if you have some money and if you have some smarts, or has that become even harder because it was all from the inside?
Well, that's an interesting question. You are raising two issues here. One of these is the fact that the purchasing power of the Syrian population has declined so much that the demand for goods has declined enormously. So finding goods in a certain way in some areas is less complicated than one would think, because very simply people buy much less goods than before. They are basically buying food and medicines and very little except for that. And most of these goods are produced in Syria. At the same time, the fact that countless, hundreds of factories were destroyed, mainly in Aleppo, by the way, so that many factories were destroyed. Supplies of goods have declined in Syria a lot. But what you are seeing in the last few months is in the areas of relative stability. I can think in particular of the coastal area. You are seeing new investments. For instance, you are seeing many new pharmaceutical plants. You have seen some food manufacturing plants. And this is because a lot of investors are realizing that one, the war is not ending anytime soon, so they have to make long-term plans. Two, the area is stable. Three, there is much less competition because many factories have been destroyed. And at the same time, imports are very expensive because the Syrian pound declined relative to the dollar. So if you are a Syrian and you want to spend, you prefer to spend in Syria, buy Syrian goods. And if you are an investor and you think that your area is relatively stable and that most of your competitors are out of business because their factories were destroyed, well, you can invest and open a small factory. And this is what you are seeing in the coastal area mainly, and in some other areas where you have seen some form of stability.
Is there an alignment along political lines that affects economic life and engagement? In other words, I'm an Alawite, or I'm a supporter of the regime, or I'm not, and therefore I don't buy bread or goods from the guy who is. Are the politics affecting the daily, everyday neighborhood economics of life?
Yes and no. I mean, what we are seeing is did probably happen in some cases. There are areas, for instance, or cities such as Homs, where you have very high sectarian tensions. But you have other areas, such as, again, the coastal area, where we have seen, if you want, a large influx of displaced people from other parts of the country, and life going on more or less normally, and people interacting and moving and helping each other a lot. If you go to Latakia, you see plenty of people from Aleppo, including a lot of Armenians, for instance, mixing with the inhabitants of the city, mainly Sunnis, with Alawites, who originally come from the mountains but now live also in the city. And, you know, in business interests come first, especially, you know, I mean, anywhere really this applies. So this, you know, also we should not forget, in spite of the war, sorry, in spite of the sectarian tensions, Syrians are used to live together, are used to trading together, are used to exchanging. So cases of the war affecting that type of transaction are not very frequent. I would also actually have to add that we have seen many instances of situation in conflict areas. For instance, on the front line between rebel and government areas, we have seen some trade contacts. For instance, near Idlib, we know of a story where in rebel-held areas there was wheat, but the flour mills were in the opposition-held areas. So there was an agreement by between the two parties that the rebels would provide wheat to the regime-held areas in exchange for the regime to send back part of the flour that is produced in the flour mills. So these are also situations that we see in wars of this time.
Provide just a little bit of hope. Let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about Turkey. Turkey has been was instrumental in Syrian economy pre-war, an important player, instrumental perhaps as much, an important player, and of course has been an important player in the actual conflict, both political and military. Now that Turkey seems to be wondering about the depth and extent of its role, given that the rebels and the potential long-term danger that the rebel forces through ISIS present for Turkey as well. Now that Turkey seems to be a little more hesitant, what does its economic involvement look like?
Well, I think from an economic point of view, Syria is not at all a priority today to Turkey. Just to give you an idea, bilateral trade between Syria and Turkey reached $2.3 billion in 2010. That was the best year of the relation between the two. In comparison, bilateral trade between Turkey and Iraq is 12 billion. With Turkey and Iran is even higher, I think not far from 20 billion. So the economic dimension was actually important because it was growing very rapidly, but it remained small compared to other countries in the region. Add to this that there was a free trade agreement between the two countries that was suspended after the beginning of the uprising and the support by the Turkish government to the opposition. So in the first 2 years of the uprising, the bilateral trade declined actually a lot. But what we have seen last year and the beginning of this one is an increase again of Turkish exports to Syria. It can be ironical, but actually it's a consequence of the destruction of the economy in northern Syria. So if you want to spend, if you want to buy any product in northern Syria, you have to import products. So Turkey is exporting again a lot of products to mainly the opposition-held areas. Very often, it's actually Syrian traders that have moved to southern Turkey that are, that act as intermediaries, as brokers that re-export. But again, the bilateral dimension, the economics of the relation today have a modest role in the overall positioning of Turkey towards the Syrian conflict, if you want.
Final question. Assad, the president, the regime, the government, is there economic, are there economic initiatives, economic entrepreneurship on the part of the government to create some semblance of control, normalcy, or is that not on their agenda at all?
Well, the problem is that the government is completely broke. I mean, the government has the capacity to continue to pay salaries, for instance, but it has admitted, for instance, that all its oil imports are financed through an Iranian credit line. Today, if the Iranians stopped funding the Syrian government, you wouldn't have a liter of gasoline or fuel oil in Damascus. So the government does not have the capacity today to fund. It will be very difficult to attract capital from anywhere, really. So the government is attempting to attract investors, but it's really a really serious challenge. As I told you, in some relatively safe areas, such as the coast, we have seen an increase in private investment, but that remains small, and you won't see any significant inflow of capital before you have clear prospects for the future. The government has announced many plans, rebuilding Hamas, for instance, rebuilding the suburbs, but they all remain, for the moment, plans. The government does not have the capacity today to fund anything.
Thank you, Jihad Yazigi in Beirut, helping us try to understand what is happening in Syria now, especially with the possibility of Armenian refugees from Kesab contemplating return to Kesab and what that means as part of the bigger picture. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for following us on CivilNet.